What if I told you that behind the most elegant mansion in New Orleans, beneath the champagne toasts and lavish parties, there was a torture chamber where people were being mutilated, starved, and chained like animals? And what if I told you the woman hosting those parties, the woman everyone called gracious and kind, was the one doing the torturing? Welcome back. Before we dive into this nightmare, hit that subscribe button because today we're uncovering one of the darkest, most disturbing stories in American history. This is the true story of Madame Delphine LaLaurie, the socialite, the serial killer, the woman whose mansion became a house of horrors. April 10, 1834. New Orleans. A fire breaks out at 1140 Royal Street, one of the most beautiful mansions in the French Quarter. Neighbors rush over to help. The fire department arrives. People are trying to get inside to save whoever might be trapped. But there's a problem. The owner of the house, Madame LaLaurie, a well-respected socialite, a woman known throughout New Orleans for her charm and grace, she's not helping. In fact, she's blocking people from entering certain parts of the house. She's grabbing her jewelry, her furs, her valuables. But when people ask about her slaves, when they ask where her servants are, she tells them to mind their own business. Some people start hearing things. Faint moans. Screams coming from somewhere upstairs. The fire is getting worse. Finally, a group of men decide they're not waiting for permission. They break down the door to the attic. And what they find, what they see in that room, it stops them dead in their tracks. Some of them vomit immediately. Others just stand there, unable to process what they're looking at. Because what they've discovered is a torture chamber. And the victims, the people chained to the walls, starved, mutilated, some barely alive, they're Madame LaLaurie's slaves. Let me paint you a picture of what those rescuers found. 7 enslaved people. Chained. Suspended by their necks. Wearing iron collars with spikes pointing inward into their flesh. Their bodies covered in scars, old wounds layered on top of new ones. One man had a hole in his head, crawling with maggots. The women had been severely mutilated. Limbs torn. Deep, infected wounds covering their bodies. Some were so weak they couldn't walk. They'd been living on nothing but gruel. And they were all trapped in that attic, in the dark, with no way out. When the cook was found chained to the kitchen stove, she confessed. She'd started the fire on purpose. She said it was a suicide attempt because she knew Madame LaLaurie was planning to take her upstairs next. And slaves who went to that attic room, they never came back. Now, you might be thinking, how did this happen? How did a woman like this, a respected member of high society, get away with this for so long? Let me tell you about Delphine LaLaurie. She was born Marie Delphine McCarty on March 19, 1787, in New Orleans when it was still under Spanish rule. She came from wealth. Old money. Her family was part of the Creole elite. She grew up in luxury, attended the finest parties, married well. In fact, she married 3 times. Her first husband died. Her second husband died. And then she married Dr. Louis LaLaurie, a physician from France who was much younger than her. In 1831, Delphine bought the property at 1140 Royal Street. She managed it in her own name, which was unusual for the time. In 1832, she built a grand mansion there. 3 stories. Attached slave quarters. She lived there with her 3rd husband and 2 of her daughters, and she became a central figure in New Orleans society. People loved her. She threw elaborate parties. She was charming, polite, always dressed impeccably. She was known for being kind to black people in public. She even freed 2 of her slaves at different points in her life. On paper, she looked like a model slave owner, if such a thing could even exist. But behind closed doors, inside that mansion, She was a monster. The rumors started early. Neighbors noticed that Madame LaLaurie's slaves looked different from other enslaved people they'd seen. They looked haggard, wretched, half-starved. Some were reportedly so thin you could see every bone in their bodies. And they moved strangely, like they were in constant pain. Word began to spread. In 1832, there was an official investigation. A local lawyer was sent to inspect the property and examine the slaves. But here's the thing about Madame LaLaurie. She was good. She knew how to charm people. She knew how to manipulate. The lawyer found no wrongdoing. He couldn't believe that such an amiable, gracious woman could be capable of harm. He was wrong. Then, in 1833, something happened that should have exposed her. A 12-year-old slave girl named Leah was combing Madame LaLaurie's hair. The girl accidentally hit a snag, pulled too hard. Madame LaLaurie flew into a rage. She grabbed a whip and chased the child through the house. Leah ran. She ran through room after room, up the stairs, out onto the balcony, and then, with nowhere else to go, she jumped. She fell from the roof and died on impact. Madame LaLaurie tried to cover it up. She had the body buried in a well behind the mansion. But neighbors had seen what happened. Police found the body. For once, there were consequences. Madame LaLaurie was found guilty of illegal cruelty. She was fined and forced to forfeit 9 of her slaves. They were taken away and scheduled to be sold at public auction. But here's what she did. She had her relatives and friends buy those 9 slaves at auction, and then she secretly brought them back to the mansion. She got them back. Every single one. And the torture continued. For another year. Until the night of the fire. Let's go back to that fire. April 10th, 1834. When the rescuers finally broke into that attic and found those 7 people chained and tortured, word spread fast. Within hours, thousands of people knew what had been discovered. The victims were taken to the local jail where they received medical treatment, food, water. And then something extraordinary happened. Over 4,000 New Orleans residents came to view them. 4,000 people lined up to see the evidence of Madame LaLaurie's cruelty with their own eyes. They needed to see it to believe it. Because this was Madame LaLaurie, the gracious hostess. The woman they dined with, danced with, respected. The crowd outside the LaLaurie Mansion grew larger and angrier by the hour. People expected the sheriff to arrest her. They waited. And waited. But the sheriff never came. It became clear that no official action was going to be taken. So the crowd transformed into a mob. They wanted vengeance. They wanted justice. And if the law wasn't going to provide it, they would. But by then, Madame LaLaurie was gone. She and her husband had fled. They'd escaped by carriage, made their way to a schooner waiting at Lake Pontchartrain, and sailed away. They left the butler behind. He participated in the torture too. The mob tore him apart. And then they turned their rage on the mansion itself. They broke in. They stripped it of everything valuable. Furniture, artwork, silver, everything. And then they tried to destroy the building entirely, tearing at the walls, damaging the roof, trying to dismantle it piece by piece. They wanted to erase every trace of what had happened there. The mansion was left in ruins. During the cleanup and investigation that followed, more bodies were discovered. They found them buried throughout the property. In the courtyard. Under the floors. One was a child. Historians estimate at least 12 enslaved people died under Madame LaLaurie's care between 1830 and 1834. 12 recorded deaths in just 4 years. And those are only the ones they found. Now let's talk about what actually happened in that attic. Because over the years, the stories have gotten more and more extreme. Some accounts from the 1940s and beyond describe things like enslaved people with their eyes gouged out, fingernails pulled out by the roots, joints skinned and festering, great holes in their buttocks where flesh had been sliced away, ears hanging by shreds, lips sewn together. There are stories about a woman trapped in a small cage with her limbs broken and reset to look like a crab. Stories about a man who appeared to be undergoing some kind of forced gender reassignment. Stories about intestines wrapped around bodies like belts. Stories about 75 bodies found under the floorboards during renovations. Here's what we know for certain from contemporary newspaper accounts and eyewitness testimony from 1834. The slaves were chained. They were starved. They were beaten. They wore spiked iron collars. They had deep scars and wounds all over their bodies. Some were suspended by their necks. At least one man had a festering wound in his head. They were kept in total darkness. They were given almost no food. And at least 2 of them died shortly after being rescued because their injuries were too severe. That's documented. That's verified. And that's horrifying enough without embellishment. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Madame LaLaurie got away with it. Completely. After she fled New Orleans, she made her way to France. In June 1834, just 2 months after the fire, an American poet encountered her on a ship sailing to France. He later wrote about meeting a pretty-looking French woman, a Madame LaLaurie, who'd committed horrible cruelties upon her slaves in New Orleans. She didn't even hide who she was. She arrived in Paris. Her husband and children eventually joined her there. She lived there for 15 years. She died on December 7, 1849, at the age of 62. No charges were ever filed. No extradition was ever attempted. She lived out the rest of her life in comfort and died of natural causes. Or possibly in a boar hunting accident, depending on which account you believe. But either way, she was never punished. Never faced justice. Never had to answer for what she did. And here's the question that haunts this story. Was Madame LaLaurie uniquely evil? Or was she just uniquely careless? Because the truth is, what she did to those enslaved people, the torture, the starvation, the brutality, that was happening on plantations all across the South. The difference is, rural plantation owners could do whatever they wanted in private. They were miles away from anyone who might witness or intervene. But Madame LaLaurie was in the city. In the heart of New Orleans. Surrounded by neighbors. Hosting parties. Living right in the middle of society. And she thought she could get away with it anyway. She almost did. Some historians argue that the iron collars, the chains, the beatings, those were fairly typical forms of restraint on rural plantations. That what seems shocking to us now was, in some contexts, considered normal. But even by the standards of 1834 New Orleans, even in a society that accepted and profited from slavery, what Madame LaLaurie did crossed the line. Her own neighbors, other slave owners, were horrified. They formed a mob. They destroyed her house. They drove her out of the city. That tells you something. Even people who owned slaves, even people who participated in that system, recognized that what she was doing was beyond the pale. Let's talk about the mansion itself. After the mob destroyed it, the property sat in ruins for years. Eventually it was rebuilt in 1838. Over the decades, it's changed hands many times. It's been a school, a conservatory, apartments, a furniture store, a bar. And yes, Nicolas Cage owned it briefly in the 2000s before he lost it due to financial troubles. Today it's a private residence. You can't go inside. But it stands there at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter, and it's become one of the most famous haunted locations in America. Ghost tours stop there every night. People claim to hear screams. They report seeing figures in the windows. They say the spirits of Madame LaLaurie's victims still haunt the building, trapped there, unable to find peace. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether ghosts are real or not. But I will tell you this. The house represents something real. It represents the horror of slavery. Not the sanitized version you learned about in school. Not the version where enslaved people worked in fields and sang songs and maybe had it rough but persevered. No. The real version. The version where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. Where they had no rights, No protection, no recourse. Where they could be beaten, starved, tortured, killed, and no one would face consequences. Where a wealthy socialite could chain people in her attic and mutilate them for years, and the only reason she got caught was because of a fire. Not because anyone cared enough to stop her before that. And here's what really gets me about this story. Madame LaLaurie was good at hiding it. She was charming in public. She freed slaves occasionally to maintain her image. She put on elaborate performances of kindness. But her slaves knew. The cook who set that fire, she knew. She knew that attic was a death sentence. She chose to burn the house down, possibly die herself, rather than be taken up there. That's how bad it was. The other slaves knew too. They just couldn't do anything about it. They had no voice. No power. No way to escape. They were completely at her mercy. And she had none. Madame LaLaurie has become a legend now. She's been featured in books, movies, TV shows. Kathy Bates played her in American Horror Story Coven and won an Emmy for it. The show took a lot of creative liberties, mixing LaLaurie's story with elements from other historical figures like Elizabeth Bathory. They made her immortal, had her using blood to stay young, all kinds of fictional additions. But the core of the story, the torture chamber, the fire, the escape to France, that's all real. And honestly, the real story is terrifying enough without any embellishment. Some people have tried to defend her over the years or at least contextualize her actions. They point out that she freed 2 slaves. They mention that she might have had mental health issues. They speculate that her husband, Dr. LaLaurie, might have been conducting medical experiments and she was just present or complicit but not the primary perpetrator. They suggest that maybe the stories have been exaggerated over time. And yes, some details have been exaggerated. The crab woman story, the intestine belts, those probably didn't happen. But does that matter? Does it matter if we don't know every exact detail of what she did? We know enough. We know she kept people chained in her attic. We know she starved them. We know she beat them until they had scars on top of scars. We know at least one man had a head wound full of maggots. We know she caused the deaths of at least 12 people. That's enough. That's more than enough. This story matters because it's a window into the reality of slavery. It's uncomfortable. It's disturbing. It's hard to hear. But it's necessary. Because for too long, the narrative around slavery has been softened. We talk about the economics. We talk about the politics. We talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction. But we don't always talk about the individual human suffering. We don't always acknowledge that slavery was, at its core, a system of violence. Daily, constant, brutal violence. And people like Madame LaLaurie, they weren't aberrations. They were products of that system. Enabled by it. Protected by it. At least until they got too careless and got caught. The enslaved people in that attic, we don't know most of their names. We know about Leah, the 12-year-old girl who jumped from the roof. We know about the elderly cook who started the fire. But the 7 people found in the attic that day, the ones who were chained and tortured, their names weren't recorded. They were just listed as slaves. Property. Not people worthy of having their identities preserved. That's the other horror of this story. Not just what happened to them, but the fact that history barely remembers them as individuals. They're footnotes in the story of Madame LaLaurie's evil. But they were people. They had lives, families, hopes, dreams, all stolen from them. And then they suffered unimaginable torture at the hands of a woman who faced no consequences. So why am I telling you this story? Why dredge up something this dark, this painful? Because it happened. Because it's part of our history. Because the people who suffered in that mansion deserve to be remembered. And because we need to understand the full reality of slavery, not just the version that's easy to digest. We need to sit with the discomfort. We need to acknowledge that systems of oppression don't just harm people in abstract ways. They create environments where someone like Madame LaLaurie can torture people in her attic for years and almost get away with it completely. They create situations where a 12-year-old girl would rather jump off a roof than face her owner's wrath. They create circumstances where a 70-year-old woman would rather burn herself alive than face what's waiting for her upstairs. That mansion still stands in New Orleans. It's beautiful from the outside. Grand architecture, iron balconies, the classic French Quarter style. Tourists walk past it every day. Most don't know the full story. They might know it's haunted or that something bad happened there. But they don't know the details. They don't know about Leah jumping from the roof. About the cook chained to the stove. About the 7 people found barely alive in the attic. About the bodies buried in the courtyard. About the woman who did all of this and then sailed away to Paris to live out her days in comfort. Now you know. Now you know the truth about Madame Delphine LaLaurie. The socialite who was secretly a serial killer. The gracious hostess who ran a torture chamber. The woman who got away with murder. If this story opened your eyes to a part of history you didn't know, hit that like button and share this video. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Should Madame LaLaurie's mansion be torn down? Should it be turned into a memorial? Should it remain standing as a reminder of what happened? I want to hear your thoughts. And subscribe because we're going to keep uncovering these stories, these dark truths that make people uncomfortable but that need to be told. Until next time, remember, history isn't pretty. It isn't neat. And sometimes, the monsters were real.